Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. My name is Tilly and I'm a strength and conditioning coach. I'm genuinely thinking that I should make some sort of playlist about my pet peeves in the fitness industry because I genuinely have so many. And luckily for you, today I'm going to share one of my biggest pet peeves that I think is actually pretty normalized within the fitness community, even though it's incorrect and a bunch of nonsense. Before we get into it, please remember to like and subscribe because it'll really help out the channel and it'll mean you get to stay up to date with some really cool sports science topics and learn a little bit more about the research behind them. So today we're going to be talking about training to failure and why I think it's silly. So what does training to failure actually mean? It's a method of training that suggests we have to work as hard as we possibly can until our literal muscles give up from underneath us. It is about pushing yourself to the absolute brink. It's synonymous with repetition maximum training, which means that you lift the heaviest load possible for the allocated amount of repetitions. So for example, if I gave you a 5 rep max to do, that would mean that you would pick the heaviest weight you can do for 5 reps maximum. So while I am talking about training to failure in this video, in the literature, it's referred to as repetition maximum training, so I'm going to call it rep max training throughout this video. So just know when you see videos online that are talking about training to failure, they're talking about rep max training. Now, some of you might be thinking, oof, I mean, I've done that before. I've definitely done that before myself as well, so don't feel bad. I want to talk about why I think this type of training is so popular. And I think honestly, rep max training is popular because it feels good. There's something really satisfying about challenging yourself and feeling that burn in your muscles, pushing yourself to a limit that you maybe didn't even know you had. Fitness is also a pretty macho space. And I think that comes from the idea of like, no pain, no gain. And if you don't leave shaking, then you didn't work out hard enough. Rep max training really fits nicely into this whole mindset of you're never doing enough, just work harder. So I mean, I can kind of get it. There's also just a crazy amount of content online from people who are clearly on copious amounts of drugs telling you to train to failure. These people, usually bodybuilders, usually look pretty good, and so we listen to them. The only real way that you're actually able to tolerate training to failure is if you're on performance enhancing drugs. Either that or you're not actually pushing yourself to failure or true failure like you think you are. For beginners, particularly, finding this limit can be really challenging. In addition to all of this in the fitness social media world, there's even some actual sports science literature that perpetuates the idea that rep max training is good. But it is all misinformed, and let me tell you why. So first of all, I'm sorry to say to some of you, but we're gonna have to talk a little bit about the science, just so that we can make sure that we're all on the same level of understanding as I go through. We're gonna talk about Henneman's size principle. This is a principle that just explains how our motor units are recruited. And a motor unit, for a little recap, is just how our muscles contract. We have big motor units and small motor units. Generally, the smaller motor units are recruited more quickly than the bigger motor units. It goes smaller and then moving into the bigger ones. And this is because it takes quite a lot for the large motor units to be activated. They have like a higher threshold of activation, and that needs to be passed before they decide to kick in. We can get those higher motor units involved more quickly when we lift higher loads, when we move rapidly, or when we do a dynamic movement. So the dynamic action rather than that isometric action where our muscles are staying the same length. And finally, when the metabolic state of our muscle changes or when we get fatigued, the higher motor units kick in a little bit more quickly. So this is just a quick graph to show you how that size principle works. You can see with low force, that's when our small motor units kick in, and then when we move into the higher force contractions, that's when our bigger motor units decide to come into play. However, while this is all well and good, let's bring it back to rep max training. The research that supports rep max training is based on a misunderstanding of this graph or a misunderstanding of the size principle. Like I said, the bigger motor units come into play more quickly when the metabolic state of the muscle changes. So this might mean when we feel that lactate buildup or when we get quite tired. So when we train to failure or when we're fatigued, it means the bigger motor units come into play much earlier. And this is in spite of the fact that the actual load on the bar is light. So based on the size principle, these researchers are getting confused because they're thinking that there's a light load on the bar. That means we'll only activate the smaller motor units. But it doesn't work like that. We're activating that whole array because of the fatigue and the changes in the metabolic state of our muscle. When we train to failure, by definition, it is always maximal training, always. You may have seen some trainers online write a light day in their program, but then have a prescription of 15 to 20 rep max. Just because there is a lighter load on the bar does not make this a light day. And that's because the motor unit recruitment is not only the smaller motor unit, it's most, if not all of them. A 20 rep max also produces a crazy amount of fatigue. One piece of research actually considered the time it takes to recover from certain rep max ranges. They found that a 20 rep max takes 4 times as long to recover from than a 5 rep max. And it takes 2 times as long to recover from that 20 rep max in comparison to the 10 rep max. So can we really consider this a light day just because there's light training on the bar? No. I can talk a lot, hey. Now let's dive into some research that clearly explains why rep max training is not ideal. I'm going to break this up into a couple of areas. First of all, I'm going to talk about why it sucks for strength development. In this systematic review and meta-analysis, you can see that of all the studies looked at, most of them preferred the non-training to failure group. The researchers even went as far as to say that rep max training is irrelevant and unnecessary for training for maximal strength. They continued on to say that if you were going to use rep max training, you should use it really sparingly. And this would be to limit the risks of injuries and the risk of overtraining. Now let's talk about it in terms of power and sports performance. In terms of the rate of force development, so the explosive power and vertical jump height, those who did not train to failure got better results. Most athletes, so just not bodybuilders, weightlifters, or powerlifters, they have to compete in a load of different training modalities, right? They have to do running, they have to do their actual sport training, and they have to perform well in the gym. So we would say that these athletes are concurrently training. When an athlete concurrently trains, rep max training is really not the way to go. One piece of literature looked at the power output for rowers. They compared one group of rowers who trained to failure versus some who did not train to failure. And guess what they found? Any takers? They found that when doing concurrent training, those who did not train to failure had a superior loaded power output. They were much more powerful. The results also showed a clearly stunted or muted gains in power for those who did do the rep max training. I mean, take a look at this graph here. You don't have to be an exercise scientist to clearly see that one group is doing so much better than the others. If you have a look, it kind of looks as if that rep max group actually went down. So we have to think about this for team sports athletes or anyone who doesn't just have to be in the gym. Is rep max training really going to be ideal for you when you're trying to develop that power, that speed, agility? Probably not. Now let's talk about hypertrophy. If bodybuilding is your goal or getting bigger muscles is your goal, there was a paper that suggested that the cross-sectional area, so the size of the muscles, for both type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers was much bigger pre to post experiment in the group that did not train to failure. And really important to note, this study was conducted on well-trained individuals. Now the reason that I bring this up is because with beginners, it's really easy to get results no matter who's training them or no matter what they're doing. And that's just because anything is usually better than the nothing that they were doing before. So when a study mentions that they used well-trained individuals or athletes, I really tend to pay closer attention because it's much more relevant and it's much more interesting to see. That's when we really find out how we should be training, I think. Now let's talk about why rep max training sucks for injuries. Monotony and strain are 2 measures that we use in strength and conditioning to check in on our athletes and to see how their workload is looking. So monotony and strain both don't sound super great, right? And that basically is because the principle of variation comes into play. Variation is a necessity to make sure that we don't overtrain or get injured, and so that we have appropriate fatigue management. If we consistently train at maximal intensity, which is what training to failure is, then that does not meet the requirement of variation. And so those monotony and strain scores will be really high. That puts us at higher risk of injuries, and we don't want that. The only way rep max training would not be seen to be monotonous is if you weren't actually pushing yourself to that limit or to that zone of failure. With all of that said, I feel like that research pretty clearly highlights why I wouldn't program training to failure for my clients, particularly those who are in team sports or have to do more than one type of training. But I think it is worth mentioning when I would have a client train to failure. And quite frankly, it wouldn't be often. I do personally use rep max training about once a month for my clients, and I just use it as a method of testing them. I really want to see if their strength has improved. I want to see if they're coping well with the level of work that I'm giving them. And it provides me some instant feedback. It gives the client some instant feedback so they can feel encouraged. Or if their strength goes down, it gives us a starting point for a conversation to talk about why they may not be coping with the load, or how we can get them to more appropriately manage their fatigue and their balance of training. Or as my partner Callum suggested, it might be a fun idea to push the last set of a couple of exercises to failure if you know you have a couple of days off afterwards and you have sufficient time for appropriate rest and recovery before your next session. So I think that pretty well encapsulates why rep max training is not a good idea. And I think I'm gonna have to make another video talking about how we should train, because it's a little bit much to put at the end of this one. But some ideas you might like to consider instead are repetitions in reserve, or RPE, or relative intensity. I'll probably make a video about all of these in the future. The one that I prefer is relative intensity, but that just means a little bit more of calculation and a little bit more work to do. But it actually helps properly prescribe heavy and light days so that we're not training to failure and so that we're not overloading our athletes. Practically, what this means for you, if you're used to training to failure in the gym, just pick up a slightly lighter weight. I'm not even going to argue that you drop a huge amount of weight off that lift. Just pick up one slightly lighter, have a couple of reps left over or left in the tank. Try not to push yourself all the way to that zone. You might find that your recovery is better or that you move better afterwards. It would be really interesting to see what you guys think. As always, if you have any questions, guys, drop them down below and I will get to them as soon as I can. If you like this video, remember to like and subscribe to support the channel and me. If you have any topics that you want me to cover or have a look at in further detail, please do let me know. If you want to contact me for coaching, shoot me an email over on my Instagram or just message me over there. I hope you guys have a wicked week ahead and I'll catch you next time. See ya. Bye.